Hey guys, Amateur Law Prof here. I want to take a few moments to talk about the Minneapolis shootings, the circumstances, the alleged perpetrator, gender identity issues, and of course, the perversion of the Second Amendment. I'm going to start with the people who matter. Yesterday morning in South Minneapolis, during a school mass at Annunciation Catholic Church, a shooter fired through stained glass into pews full of kids and parishioners. 2 children, ages 8 and 10, were killed. 17 others were wounded. 14 of those were children. 3 were elderly parishioners. Now, police say the injured are expected to survive, thank goodness. The shooter died at the scene of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Police identified the suspect as 23-year-old Robin Westman. Investigators say a rifle, a shotgun, and a handgun were used, all purchased legally and recently. Exits on one side of the church were found barricaded from the outside. The FBI is treating this as domestic terrorism and a possible hate crime targeting Catholics. The motive review is ongoing. Now I want to talk about gender identity here. Records about gender identity are straightforward. Records show a 2020 name change from Robert to Robin with filing stating a female identity. Local reporting says the driver's license lists Robin as female. Officials have warned against using any of this to smear transgender people who had nothing to do with the crime. Hold 2 ideas at once. Mental health, racism, and violence are not limited to one particular group. Report the facts. Refuse stigma against the transgender community. I want to pause and center on the families here. I'm a father of 2. I've lost friends to guns, by others, and by their own hand. I've litigated cases involving the loss of a child. 2 children are gone. 17 families are sitting by hospital beds. Minneapolis will live with this grief for years. There are parents that are broken. Keep the focus on them as the facts develop. Let them focus on themselves and what they are going to have to go through to heal. In other words, leave them the hell alone. People are already asking whether mass shootings by transgender people are common. The best data says that they are rare. Using the Gun Violence Archive definition for a mass shooting is at least 4 people shot, not including the shooter, researchers counted thousands of incidents since 2016. Cases with a known transgender suspect are in the single digits, about 0.1%. That is well below the share of transgender Americans in the population, which the Williams Institute now estimates at roughly 1% of people's ages 13 and up, about 2.8 million people. Precision matters here. So does refusing to generalize from outliers. Under a stricter category for public mass shootings with 4 or more people killed, the Violence Project finds that perpetrators are overwhelmingly male and that transgender perpetrators are virtually absent in their data set. A single high-profile case can still distort perception, which is why we lead with numbers and not narratives. And you're going to hear a lot of narratives. Now to the policy fight that always follows here. Why has there been so little federal movement on guns compared with other democracies that changed course after one massacre? Well, Congress let the 1994 federal assault weapons ban expire in 2004, and they never reinstated it. The major federal law since then is the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022. It funds crisis intervention, tightens under 21 background checks, and supports state red flag laws. Important, but narrow. Now, courts changed the ground under our feet. In 2022, the Supreme Court decided Bruin. The court rejected traditional scrutiny which had been applied to these cases and then told judges to rely on text, history, and tradition. That move created a history-only test that many lower courts struggle to apply. They're not historians. The court later clarified in Rahimi that history and analogy are not a straitjacket and that government can disarm people found to be a credible threat. Even so, the doctrinal turbulence is real. Here's why many historians and scholars say Bruin is historically wrong and twisted. The first problem is, of course, cherry picking. The majority labeled New York's May issue regime an outlier and discounted a long record of 19th century public carry limits, surety laws, and good cause statutes that conditioned armed carriage on showing need. Historians and state attorneys general documented those laws in depth. The opinion brushed many of those aside as late, not representative, or irrelevant. They put the issue first and the result first. That's not neutral history, that is selection. The second problem is the time slice. For state gun laws, the right applies through the 14th Amendment. In 1868 it was passed, yet Bruin largely privileged 1791 sources and treated later Reconstruction-era regulations as lesser. Scholars point out the Reconstruction period is when the right was applied against states and when governments openly regulated public carry, concealed weapons, and dangerousness, often to protect the peace after the Civil War. The court's method downplayed that body of law. The third problem here is how the test empowers what critics call law office history. Judges with no training in archival methods now adjudicate by dueling footnotes, choosing which era and which analogies count. That produces subjective and inconsistent outcomes across the country. Even the court in Rahimi acknowledged lower court confusion and emphasized that analogical reasoning should extract principles, not demand historical twins. That is a quiet retreat from the most rigid readings of Bruin. The fourth problem is internal inconsistency. Bruin said sensitive places restrictions are fine by analogy and insisted the test is not interest balancing. Yet it also rejected many analogs as not close enough while refusing to say what level of generality is right. Justice Breyer's dissent warned that this history-only approach would be unworkable and would ignore empirical public safety concerns that every other constitutional context allows courts to weigh. That prediction largely came true. Look abroad for contrast. After Port Arthur in 1996, Australia adopted the National Firearms Agreement and bought back hundreds of thousands of guns. Strong evidence links those reforms to reduction in mass shootings and firearm deaths. After Dunblane in 1996, the UK banned most handguns and completed a national surrender in short order. After Christchurch in 2019, New Zealand banned most semi-automatic rifles and ran a national buyback within weeks. Canada has imposed a national handgun freeze and broader reforms under Bill C-21. These are national moves on tight timelines. The United States adopted limited federal reforms and then let courts twist history into a threshold test that is still being re-explained, now 3 years later. I'm closing where I began. 2 families lost children. 17 families are waiting for updates. The FBI and local police will keep releasing facts, but let's keep the focus on the people who were hurt. If you see this tragedy weaponized to smear an entire group, fight back with verified facts and fight back with focus on the families. That's the decent thing to do. Until next time.